You're watching Mugen TV RPG Haven. Experience a fantasy like no other.
Hey guys, it's Mugalore here, and before we dive into today's topic, I want to let you guys know, if you have checked out my previous video where I talk about Astral Chain and why it's became one of my favorite action RPGs of this generation for the Nintendo Switch. If you're interested in hearing my thoughts on it and why I believe that this is definitely an overlooked game for this generation and that everybody should definitely look into it, check out the video. I definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment section. So let's dive into today's topic. Today, I want to talk about Final Fantasy IX. Why I'm talking about Final Fantasy IX? I mean, it's such an old game at this point that has seen plenty of remasters from time and time again. Well, Final Fantasy IX, if you haven't been following any of the leaks or the rumors that's been surrounding this game, Final Fantasy IX is supposed to be receiving a remake. Yes, that's right, a Final Fantasy IX remake. Of all Final Fantasy games for them to remake, they decided to remake one of my other favorite Final Fantasy games besides Final Fantasy VII. Now, this Final Fantasy IX remake may sound ridiculous. It just seems so far-fetched. It doesn't seem like a possibility because Square Enix is currently working on Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is supposed to be broken into multiple parts. So how can they juggle yet another Final Fantasy remake? Well, to me, in my opinion, it's looking more and more like a possibility that this may be the case, that this is actually happening. So why do I believe that? Well, if you haven't been following leaks and rumors, and I mentioned this in a couple of other videos in the past, the Nvidia website or the Nvidia service that pretty much is kind of like Steam where they release games and everything. Well, it seems like their website back in September of last year has been leaked. Now, this leaked list has leaked a bunch of different games. I mean, it's a slew of games that just look like, man, this seemed like a dream list. So many sequels, so many new IPs, everything that this site had, and it's been leaked. And then Nvidia themselves even came out and said that, hey, this leak list is real. And then after that, the site had removed the list. So luckily somebody else had recovered it and put it up on Reddit, so you guys can go check it out. And I'll definitely leave that in the link in the description below for you guys to check out the leaked list, because it has everything besides what we're talking about in this video. Well, on the leak list, they had a couple of Final Fantasy titles, and also Kingdom Hearts 4 was also found in it. But if you look at it, this is before the announcement of other titles. We have Final Fantasy IX Remake on the list, Final Fantasy Origins, Final Fantasy Tactics Remaster, and of course Final Fantasy 16. Now, if you look at the dates are incorrect, but you got to understand this is when the whole COVID situation had definitely delayed a lot of the release dates for this game. So just because it says April for Final Fantasy IX Remake doesn't mean we'll see it in April. It's definitely going to be pushed back due to the whole COVID season, and Square Enix did confirm that a lot of things as far as the development cycle for certain games has definitely been hindered by this whole COVID situation. So now what definitely raises my eyebrows and what makes me believe that Final Fantasy IX Remake is definitely going to happen is for the simple fact is, if you guys don't know, also on the leak list, it had Chrono Cross Remastered months in advance. Now, ever since that happened, a lot of YouTubers, a lot of people who follow JRPGs, and especially on the Facebook group, I'm part of a Chrono Facebook page that I just look at from time to time. Everybody been arguing and debating whether or not that this list is real, and people was wondering, will this remaster receive for Chrono Cross? Will it receive the same treatment as Trials of Mana, or will it just be a full-on HD just remaster of the PS1 version of Chrono Cross? So for months, we have heard nothing about this remaster for Chrono Cross until last week when Nintendo had made their surprise direct and they revealed that in fact Chrono Cross is not only just coming to the Nintendo Switch, but it's also coming to other platforms like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, and of course the PC. So now that we know that Chrono Cross is a real thing and it's actually a remaster that the Nvidia list had revealed and has been leaked out, it's looking more and more possible that Final Fantasy IX Remake is definitely going to be a thing. It has to be at this point. And we still waiting on Final Fantasy Tactics Remastered to pop up at some point. And I believe that's definitely going to pop up before we hear anything about Final Fantasy IX. And if Final Fantasy Tactics pop up, that definitely reassures and confirms that Final Fantasy IX Remake is definitely going to be a thing. But I'll definitely be covering the Final Fantasy Tactics Remastered portion in a later video. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and like the video if you want to stay up to date with that. But as far as Final Fantasy IX Remake, I can definitely see this happen. Now, the question that I have right now when it comes to this inevitable reveal, will it take the same approach as Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's broken into parts, or will it be a full experience? That's where the question is. And if Final Fantasy IX happens to reveal itself and it comes to find out that it won't be broken into parts and it's going to be a full experience, then I'm definitely going to have some questions with Square Enix and why they decide to make Final Fantasy VII Remake into parts. And I think that question pretty much answers itself, that it's just they want to milk it and make money because Final Fantasy VII is much more popular. But why do I like this? Why do I like to see what they would do with this? Will they actually make this more one-to-one and faithful to what Final Fantasy VII Remake is doing? Why do I like Final Fantasy IX so much? Well, in my opinion, I believe, like, besides Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX was another one of my favorite Final Fantasy games because it was also my first introduction to the crystals, because I didn't know that the original Final Fantasy games focused on the crystals and the warriors and the heroes of light, or the warriors of light. But Final Fantasy IX had reintroduced the crystals once again. That's why when I bought Final Fantasy IX, and in the back of the covers of the case, it said that the crystals are back. I had no idea what that meant until later on I played Final Fantasy IV on the PlayStation 1 with the Final Fantasy Chronicles. Final Fantasy IV also had crystals in it. I was like, oh, okay, I understand. So the previous games dealt with crystals of the past. So that's why that was my introduction to that. Not only that, the world and the story itself is unique. I mean, the characters were so weird and so wacky looking, and at first it did turn me away when Square first introduced us to the cast of Final Fantasy IX. But once I actually played the game, I just fell in love with the story. I fell in love with the world. I fell in love with the characters. They're so charming. They had just a uniqueness to them. And then also, the game Final Fantasy IX has also returned characters to a defined class. So each character actually had their own class with their own unique set of skills and abilities, which means it made taking party members in and out and putting them in your party, depending on where you're at and where you're grinding, where you're trying to level, and what bosses you're trying to defeat, that really determined your party order and when to take parties in and out based on their class and how useful it would be during battle, which is also different for the Final Fantasy games in the PS1 era. And then of course the equipment system was pretty unique, where you were able to learn abilities based on the equipment that you found. So you couldn't just discard the equipment that you had in Final Fantasy IX. You actually had to hold on to old equipment just for you to learn the skills off of those, so you can permanently have them equipped to your character for good and you're able to use them. And not only that, those equipment was also used to be able to better defend yourself against enemies with particular elements to them, like status effects. So even though the armor may be weak, it was also better to have that armor on to be able to resist against certain abilities that certain monsters have, which I thought was pretty cool. And then the cutscenes, man. Final Fantasy IX had, to me, in my opinion, had the most cutscenes, and they were beautiful cutscenes. And that was another way to highlight how beautiful and how fantastical the world of Final Fantasy IX is. And not only that, it was the last great Final Fantasy game of the PS1 era. I believe after Final Fantasy IX, Square Enix wasn't able to find footing going into the next generation with Final Fantasy. Even though Final Fantasy X was a good game, but Final Fantasy X was the mark of where Final Fantasy started feeling a bit linear, and feel like that Square was experimenting with the Final Fantasy series, you know, at that time, and Final Fantasy just fell off just a little bit. It started losing that name recognition just a bit. But man, just with that being said, I'm definitely looking forward to hear whether or not there's going to be a Final Fantasy IX remake. Definitely one. I wouldn't know what to do, man. I wouldn't know what to do. I'm just more curious to see what their approach is and how they would handle Final Fantasy IX if there in fact is going to be a remake. But that pretty much wraps up this video. I definitely want to hear your thoughts and what you think of how Square Enix will handle Final Fantasy IX remake. And do you think that this list is in fact real? Do you think that is some validity to this? Do you think there will be a potential announcement for Final Fantasy IX? Definitely want to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. If you like the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If you want to stay up to date and to more Final Fantasy news, specifically whether or not Final Fantasy IX will happen, remake will happen, definitely hit the bell to be notified. This is Mugen Lord signing off. I'll see you game fiends later. Peace out.